Okay, hello. Our two sessions today are both about Czechoslovakia. In the first one, I want to talk a little bit about the country in the 1960s and talk about the quite exciting but ultimately unsuccessful reforms which took place within the Communist Party and the society in the second half of the 1960s. So it's kind of a delayed de-Stalinization, similar to the kind of thing we saw in Hungary and in Poland and other parts of the bloc in the 1950s. It came a little bit later for various reasons in Czechoslovakia, and the ultimate sort of results of this were more dramatic, culminating in 1968 in the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in an attempt to sort of arrest the changes that were taking place in that country. So we'll talk a little bit about what's happened in this country since we left it at the end of the Second World War. Or in the 1950s at least, talk a little bit about where this reform movement came from, talk about the reasons why it ended in the way it did, and try also to talk about the sort of aftermath of the Soviet invasion, not just in Czechoslovakia, but also what this meant for the communist bloc, for the rest of the countries in the communist bloc. Many people would depict the invasion and its aftermath as a very important turning point, a moment when many people, an entire generation, in fact, in the communist bloc in Central and Eastern Europe, came to realize that this system could not be changed. They sort of they felt that the promises and the hopes of the communist system were over. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then in the second session, I want to talk about Václav Havel, who was the most important and undoubtedly the most famous example of what became known as the dissidents, or the anti-communist dissidents. So I want to speak a little bit about him, talk about the concept of a dissident, who they were, what they did, why they were important, not just in Czechoslovakia again, but throughout the entire bloc. And in particular, I want to talk about one text of his which became very influential and remains, in fact, even in post-communist in the post-communist period, also still highly relevant and highly important. This is a text called "The Power of the Powerless." Okay, so let's look then at the slideshow. Let's go to slide number 2. Quick recap. We've talked a little bit about Czechoslovakia already, haven't we? A state that was formed at the end of the First World War. In the interwar period, the state was unlike other states in the region insofar as its democratic traditions did not collapse in on themselves. Other states, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Romania, Hungary, Poland, began as democracies at the end of the First World War, but ultimately became one form of dictatorship or the other. In Czechoslovakia, the democratic traditions survived right up until the Munich Treaty, the Munich Pact of 1938, which annexed the western territories of Czechoslovakia, which were had large sort of numbers of ethnic Germans, and this essentially was the end of Czechoslovak democracy. So it didn't collapse in and of itself. There was no sort of domestic, there was no internal shift towards dictatorship, but nevertheless democracy ended in 1938. The country was of course occupied and dismembered by the Axis during the Second World War, and then it was revived at the end of the Second World War, and we saw that in 1948 the Communist Party sort of seized power in the so-called Victorious February Revolution. That was obviously in February 1948. So the country under communism, in the 1950s particularly, the Czechoslovak state was a very sort of troubled place, a dark place. We talked a little bit about the trial of Rudolf Slansky, which was part of these trials that took place in the bloc after Tito broke. Remember, we talked a couple of weeks ago about how there were various party purges throughout the bloc. Stalin attempting to get rid of people who he feared might be independent minded, might be nationalist minded, accused them of this kind of made up charge of Titoism. That also happened in Czechoslovakia, but it was sort of entangled with a very nasty sort of anti-Semitic strain as well. This was called an anti-Zionist campaign. It was ostensibly directed at sort of towards Israel and towards the fear that the remaining Jews within Eastern Europe would be more supportive and more loyal of Israel than they would be of their own countries. But essentially, this was kind of an anti-Semitic societal purge. And anti-Semitism was not something new in the bloc. It was not something new in Central and Eastern Europe, sad to say, just as it was not something new in Russia. But it was perhaps disappointing for many people that the communists, with their claims and with their promises of emancipation and of building a better world and of equal rights, no matter what your background, were also reverting to these sort of these old-fashioned anti-Semitic tropes. And the trial of Rudolf Slansky in 1952 was a particularly nasty example of these sort of this entanglement of so-called Titoism and national communism, but at the same time a very virulent strain of anti-Semitism. And I think I told you a little bit about the end of Slansky, just to show sort of how vindictive the communists could be. His son, who was sort of like 8 or 9 at the time, was called to denounce his father, claim that he was happy that his father was going to be executed. You can just imagine, without having any sympathy towards Slansky himself, you can imagine what this must be like to sort of, in your final days, to have your child, your son, denouncing you in this way. After Slansky was executed, he was hanged. His remains were cremated, and they were mixed into a cement mixer, and used to sort of cement a road going out of Prague. So it's really almost kind of sadistic, the extent to which the Czechoslovak communists went after Slansky and went after their enemies. There's a very good book actually called Under a Cruel Star. I'm going to add that to the slide, by a Czechoslovak Jewish woman who was first of all put into the camps during the Second World War, put into Terezin as a child, escaped, got back to Prague, and then goes through this sort of these anti-Semitic purges at the end of the Second World War. Her husband is in the Communist Party, and he's sort of arrested and executed. So it kind of talks about the double horror that many Czechoslovak Jews faced at this time. Now let's move then to slide number 3. Just a very quickly recap what was happening in this country. Czechoslovakia was the economic and industrial powerhouse of Central Europe, had been going right back to the 19th century, right back to the Habsburg Empire. You remember I talked about the Škoda works, I talked about the industrialized base in Bohemia. So it remained an industrial powerhouse throughout the right up into the communist period, right up until the beginning of the 1960s. There was a long memory of democratic traditions going back to the First Republic, going back to the interwar period. Many Czechoslovaks would have been alive at that time, of course, but in any case, they would remember their history. They would remember people like Masaryk. They would remember the fact that democracy survived in this country in the interwar period, and they would sort of cherish those democratic traditions. Now, there was, of course, initial support for communism in the initial elections at the end of the Second World War. The communists, of course, won those elections. They were relatively free and fair, although not entirely. And there are various reasons for this. Of course, the Czechoslovak Communist Party had been legal in the interwar period. Many people had felt betrayed by the Western Allies as a result of the Munich Pact, the so-called Munich Betrayal. So at least initially, there was a belief that maybe communism could be sort of infused, could be suffused with the democratic traditions of Czechoslovakia, that maybe there was a new way of sort of, it didn't have to be like the Soviet Union, but it didn't have to be like the West. There was perhaps a unique Czechoslovak brand of socialism that could be sort of created by joining these democratic traditions of the pre-Second World War period with this kind of support, this popular support for communism, and this notion became very important in the period that we're going to talk about today, in the 1960s. Now, there had been no de-Stalinization in the 1950s, unlike Poland, unlike Czechoslovakia, unlike Hungary. There was no relaxation. There was no changing of the system during the years immediately after the death of Stalin. And that there are various reasons for this, and probably the most important one was that unlike in Poland and unlike in Hungary, first of all, there was a sort of basis of support for the Communist Party. It was not simply seen as some alien Russian entity that had been grafted onto the Czechoslovak state, but it also in the 1950s, unlike in Poland and unlike in Hungary, Czechoslovakia had not experienced a significant economic downturn. The Pilsen works were still running. The country was still pretty economically viable. And economically culpable. So at least initially, the kind of things that we talked about a few weeks ago, the kind of things that happened elsewhere in the bloc, in Hungary and in Poland, did not happen in Czechoslovakia. So rehabilitation, for example, of victims of the communist purge, a rethinking of the history of the Second World War, of the kind that we saw Andrzej Wajda and the great filmmakers of the Polish school. None of this had really happened in Czechoslovakia during the 1950s. There had not really been any kind of de-Stalinization. Now, there were a few wobbles in a Pilsen factory. So Pilsen is a town in the west of Bohemia. It's the home of Pilsner beer, incidentally, which is and there's a pretty cool brewery that you can sort of go around, and the brewery has been there since the 19th century, and you can sort of learn about the history of beer making. It's a little bit like St James's Park in Dublin. You get your free beer at the end as well, and it's quite delicious. But there's a factory there, and there had been some protesting and some striking in Pilsen in 1953. Something to do with the working conditions, obviously related to the sort of the kind of tremors that were going throughout the bloc as a result of the death of Stalin, but this did not transform into anything like what happened in Poznan in Poland a few years later in 1956. To say nothing of the of the outright sort of quasi-revolution which took place in Hungary in 1956. Now, the communist leader was a man named Antonin Novotny. He took over from his predecessor. It was a man called Klement Gottwald. Gottwald caught the flu when he went to Moscow for Stalin's funeral. It's quite cold. This is still only March. It can be quite cold in Moscow in March. He caught the flu and he died a couple of weeks later. I don't know why I'm laughing about that. But there was a lot of jokes about how Gottwald, of course, was a dyed-in-the-wool Stalinist. And there were a lot of jokes in Czechoslovakia about how Gottwald was so obedient to Stalin that he very obediently died in 2 weeks 2 weeks later from Stalin. Okay, now things did begin to change at the beginning of the 1960s, and they did so in the following way. For the first time, sort of around 1961, 1962, an economic crisis or economic problems started to emerge in Czechoslovakia. The targets of the 5-year plan, which I think ended in 1961 or 62, something like that, were not met. The economy was underperforming, and all of a sudden, all of those sureties, all of those sort of complacencies of the 1950s were starting to be challenged. The economy of the country, as I say, was not functioning in the way that people wanted it to, and this began a tentative discussion about the direction that Czechoslovakia should be taking. So it's always the case in communist societies, in communist states, and certainly at this time in the 1950s and the 1960s, that a discussion about the economy is always intrinsically also a political discussion. And the reason for that, of course, is that the economy is a political thing. Of course, we all know that it's true also in the West, but it is intrinsically linked to political discussions in the communist bloc. The communists essentially sort of thought of themselves as fixing the economy, of sort of turning the economy into something which would give prosperity to everyone, but also would be the most productive and the most efficient and the most successful. So when it starts to go off the rails, as it did in Czechoslovakia at the beginning of the 1960s, when people start to discuss the direction that the economy should take, it very quickly also becomes a broader discussion about politics. Now, it happens repeatedly in the communist bloc, and we'll see in a couple of weeks' time that it also happens in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. When Gorbachev comes to power in the middle of the 1980s, his reforms, the so-called perestroika movement, are all, again, intrinsically related to the underperformance of the Soviet economy and the many problems that it's experiencing because of the war in Afghanistan and all of these sorts of things. It's impossible simply to separate the economy from a much larger discussion about the Communist Party, about communist rule, about communist government. So that was beginning to happen. For the first time, the Czechoslovak communists and Czechoslovak society as well were forced to sort of look back to everything that had happened since the end of the Second World War and start to ask questions about the direction that they had taken. So it was very often simply questions like, well, look, there are memoirs of the time, or newspaper reports, for example, that I was sort of been reading recently, that start to question whether it was wise to put this factory in this part of Slovakia, which is right next to a Roma village, or right next to a sort of a residential area, because it's poisoning the water, or it's creating a lot of pollution, or it costs sort of millions of Czech crowns to put this factory in place, and in fact the resources, the coal or the lignite, which they're digging out of the ground, is only worth actually, there wasn't as much there as the communist planners believed. These were the kind of questions that people were asking. Why did we make these decisions in the 40s? What happened? Why did we decide to go in this direction with a 5-year plan? Why did we spend money developing these parts of the economy when we didn't develop these other parts? It's kind of similar to the discussion that I was talking about last week, when I talked about how Khrushchev came back from the United States and decided essentially to sort of redirect the economy, away from heavy industry, away from factories, away from industrialization, and maybe put a little bit greater emphasis on consumption and leisure time and this sort of thing. So again, there are discussions about the economy, but these necessarily become also discussions about the political decisions of the Communist Party, and those are potentially much more decisive. Those are much more consequential, because all of a sudden people are saying, well, look, I mean, if they got the economy wrong, and they got this wrong about these factories, and they've got it wrong about these sorts of things, what about the trials? We know, for example, that Khrushchev has been now very critical of Stalin, and has said that he unfairly persecuted people, and that he created this system of prison camps, and a lot of innocent people were caught up in that. Is it not possible that in our country, with all of this Slansky trial and all of the denunciations of the 1950s, that perhaps also we've made some mistakes, or rather the Communist Party have made some mistakes, that the people that they said were guilty back in the 1950s maybe were not guilty. Maybe the whole story has not been told. Now, again, it's kind of intriguing the way it happened in Czechoslovakia, because it's not like many other parts of the bloc. It's not like Poland. It's not like Hungary. It's not like Romania. And the reason it's not like that is that from the very beginning, there were a very large number of people, as we saw from the elections in 1945, in May 1945. There were a very large number of Czechoslovak people, must be said more Czechs than Slovaks, but nevertheless, throughout the country, there were very many people who sincerely believed in the communist ideal, and believed that this would sort of deliver, a better, brighter future. An entire generation of people who had been very young at the end of the Second World War, maybe would have dim memories of the First Republic, the interwar period, but their parents would have a bit more vivid memories, which they would pass on to them. Many of them would remember the Second World War, and they would sort of come to these terms. Very quickly, I just want to show you something from my library, which is quite an interesting topic. So just wait there. There's a very good novel which is available to buy. You can read that. It's called Josef Skvorecki's book, The Cowards. It's a novel which Skvorecky, he had been one of these people. He had been very young in the Second World War, and he'd been like 17 or 18 at the end of the Second War. He was interested in jazz, and he was in a band. And his book, The Cowards, which was written in like 1948 or 49, when Skvorecky was only sort of 24, 25 years old, tells the story of what it is like to be very, very young. So, for example, the same age as many of you, that many of you are now, but having lived through this sort of occupation, lived through this and sort of coming out and seeing this new era of socialism and hope and this sort of thing. It's very funny, of course. It's a rite of passage. So Skvorecki's character is primarily interested in getting laid, of course, and getting a girlfriend. It's a very interesting novel. There's a very funny moment where towards the end of the war, he's worried because he hasn't done anything for the resistance, and he's working in a factory which is producing propeller blades for Messerschmitt planes in the Luftwaffe. And as a last-minute act of futile resistance, he sort of starts to sabotage, like he gets the measurements wrong. And he's called in by his factory boss and said, "What the hell are you doing? You realize that we know what's going on. If I report this to the Germans, they're going to execute you. They'll probably execute your family as well. You have to go back, work through the night, and produce these Messerschmitt blades to the right sort of measurements. Why are you attempting to sort of do this?" So it's a very good book, and I can recommend that if you're interested in this period. And it's available. It's like 10 euros. I think you can get a Kindle. The translation is very good. And Skvorecky has a preface at the beginning where he talks about the environment in which he wrote this book, the fact that the communists censored the book for about 15 years. In fact, it wasn't until the 60s that the book came out. Okay, now that's perhaps not entirely irrelevant excursus into Skvorecky, because in fact there were an entire generation of men and women like him who had been very young at the end of the Second World War, who had embraced or at least supported communism in the 1948 revolution, and were now sort of a little bit older. They were now kind of in their 30s, maybe coming up to their 40s. These were still people. This is perhaps what's most interesting about Czechoslovakia in the 1960s. The problems of the 1950s, the suppression, the trials, and now the economic problems of the early 1960s. All of these things had not exactly, in most cases, disillusioned, not at this stage, the men and women like Skvorecky, who had been supporters of communism. What happened now was that these people felt, okay, well, it's what we can do in this moment of sort of transformation and this moment of crisis is we can sort of apply the principles of communism. We can suffuse them, we can transfuse them with the democratic traditions that we have in our country from the interwar period, and we can actually create something much better. We can create a new kind of communism, a new socialist system, which will actually be the envy of the entire world. The envy of the rest of the Eastern Bloc, but also the envy of the capitalist system. So it wasn't that the problems of the 1950s and the new problems of the early 1960s turned off people, Czechs and Slovaks, to communism. In most cases, that generation of people who had supported the party at the end of the Second World War now said, okay, here's our opportunity to sort of really follow through on the revolution, to create a communist system which is reformed, which is transformed, and which is superior to the ones we have. This is a unique opportunity. Now, if we look at the sort of the generation of intellectuals, these are people like, I don't know if you've heard of any of these men, Ludwig Vaculík, Ivan Klima, Václav Havel. We'll talk about him in the second session, and a Czech author who some of you may have heard of. He's still alive, remarkably, in his 90s. A Czech author called Milan Kundera. Probably the most famous internationally Czech author. He's written novels like The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which some of you may know. They made a film with Daniel Day-Lewis and what's her name, Juliette Binoche, which is kind of the book is better, but the film is quite fun as well. It has Daniel Day-Lewis and Juliette Binoche in it, for God's sake, so it can't all be bad. Now, Kundera, if we turn to slide number 5, another novel recommendation. Kundera, his first novel is a novel called The Joke, and it became, for many people, the exemplary novel of the experiences of this generation who supported communism initially at the end of the Second World War. It's his first novel. It's obviously sort of semi-autobiographical. And in The Joke, Milan Kundera tells the story of how... essentially the story goes in the following way. And I'll try not to give any spoilers. But it's about a young man who, at the end of the Second World War, supports communism, goes along with the party, believes in the sort of the prospects of the Communist Party. He's dating a girl who's also very earnestly and very sincerely, and to a certain extent humorlessly, interested in communism as well. And he writes her a letter. And in this letter, he puts some off-color joke about Trotsky, which he thinks is very innocuous, but his girlfriend takes it very seriously, reports him. A rival in the party picks up on this, makes a big deal out of it, and as a result, the protagonist, the person who wrote this joke, is sent into a communist prison camp for much of the 50s. So by the time it gets to the 1960s, when the novel is set, this person is seriously broken. His hopes for communism have faded. He's been in a hard labor camp for a decade, so he's aged prematurely, and he's extremely sort of frustrated and extremely embittered. And basically, he seizes on an opportunity to sort of humiliate this person who used this joke to sort of denounce him, not his girlfriend, but the high party functionary who was his rival back in the end of the 1940s. So he concocts a very elaborate plan for revenge, and I won't tell you what happens, but of course it doesn't go exactly according to plan. It's a very good novel, and it really is one of the best sort of psychological insights into this generation. Kundera does extremely well, even better than Shkvoretsky, I would say, is extremely good at evoking the mentality of that young generation of Czechoslovaks who sincerely believed that communism could do a lot for them, and became sort of disillusioned or became sort of became unsteadied by the sort of the history of the the 1950s. Okay, so what happened basically? Well, in the second part of the 1950s, 60s, de-Stalinization in a sense arrived in Czechoslovakia. If we look at slide number 6, Novotny was replaced by a man called Alexander Dubček, who was in fact a Slovak communist. Dubček was a party functionary. He'd been a part of the party since the Second World War. He'd been in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. He was a lifelong, dyed-in-the-wool Communist Party functionary, party member. But at the same time, he was very much in tune with the atmosphere and the zeitgeist of the mid-late 1960s in Czechoslovakia. He thought that what was happening in the country was an opportunity to sort of reform and to transform and to improve the communist system. So he was an older man, as you can see in this picture. He was not of the generation of people like Kundera and Vaculík. We'll speak a little bit more about Vaculík in the second session. But nevertheless, he was somebody who did have some sort of political vision, did have a notion that maybe this was an opportunity to create something better in Czechoslovakia, to create an improved form of socialism. And this is what Dubček came to call socialism with a human face. The notion that there would be a better economy, there would be a better political system, but it would still be socialism, but it would be like a Czechoslovak socialism. The moving spirit behind this was the action program of April 1968, which sort of laid out the possibilities, the opportunities, but the necessary steps which would have to be taken in order to create this sort of advanced and more sophisticated communist system. There was also Vaculík, who very famously wrote a short essay called The 2,000 Words. You can find that quite easy by Googling it, which is also a sort of an example of an example of the sort of the mentality and the thinking, but also the hopes of this time. Okay, now whenever one of these blocks, we must remember that whenever one of these Eastern European countries, of course with the exception now of Yugoslavia, which is outside of the bloc, whenever one of these Eastern European countries starts to make changes, whenever there are discussions and sort of transformations within the country, there is always the larger question of what the Soviet Union, how the Soviet Union will react, how the Soviet Union will respond. Although no one says it in as many words, it remains a fact that you have the Soviet Union and then you have the Eastern Bloc. And the countries like Czechoslovakia, like Romania, like Hungary, like Poland are essentially politically subordinated to the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Treaty Organization, the military alliance of which they are a part, is essentially, the Soviet Union's means of keeping a lid on these countries. So men like Dubček, when they start to make political and economic transformations within their country, there is always this lingering question of how the Soviet Union will respond, what they will do, what steps they will take. And of course the memory of Budapest, which was a mere sort of 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, in 1967, 1968, is very vivid in the minds of the Czechoslovak Reform communists. They're very sort of conscious that what happened there might also happen in Czechoslovakia. So Dubček, as a loyal communist, and to a certain extent someone who was loyal also to the Soviet Union and to the Warsaw Pact, the Warsaw Treaty Organization, is very cautious about the direction that this reform is taking and might take, mindful of the potential Soviet response. Now, there's a great moment a little bit earlier in 1967, and really 67 and 68 are the sort of the pivotal years in this process. But there's a very famous moment when Brezhnev visits, so the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the leader of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev. There he is in slide number 7, visits Czechoslovakia, hears a little bit about the reform movement, and very famously makes quite a cryptic comment. In Russian, he says, "Это ваше дело," which essentially translated into English would mean "that's your business." It's one of those moments. I don't know if you know very well French history. Very famously, Charles de Gaulle, the French president in the 1950s, visited Algeria, met with the so-called Pieds Noirs, so the white Algerian French settlers, but also met with the Arabs, spoke to both parties, and at the end of it said, I don't speak French, I'm afraid, je te comprends, I have understood you. Which again could be interpreted whichever way you want it, really. It was a cryptic and vague comment. It became very famous, very notorious, and all sides believed that Charles de Gaulle was speaking to them, that he was signaling them. Brezhnev's "Это ваше дело," that's your business, had a similar ring. Of sort of crypticness and opacity. Exactly what did he mean by this? What would it wasn't a clear signal in any direction. Now, in slide number 8, as always, just as in 1956 with Hungary, the transformations, the changes that were taking place in the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic had potential repercussions for the rest of the bloc. The Soviets knew this. They knew that what was happening in Czechoslovakia would be watched by the party leadership and the societies in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, and it could possibly have repercussions. So, for example, if what was happening in Czechoslovakia happened also, if it got out of hand, if what was happening in Czechoslovakia went the same way as what happened, for example, in Hungary in 1956, the Soviets would have precisely the same problem as they did back then, a potential domino effect, a potential unraveling of the bloc. So it was over 10 years. It was more than 10 years. It was 12 years after the Hungarian invasion, but essentially the logic of the Cold War, the logic of keeping states together within the bloc, had not altered, had not transformed. The Soviets were still concerned about their buffer zone. They were still concerned about preserving the integrity of the bloc. Now, it's also very interesting that in other parts of the bloc, the responses to the transformations that seem to be taking place in Czechoslovakia, the reforms, because the party leaderships in places like East Germany, in places like Hungary, in places like Romania, in places like Poland, were also watching very closely because they knew that if Dubček got into trouble, or indeed if he succeeded or he failed, that would have consequences also for their control within their own country, that they might also experience pressure from below to change their systems, that they might have to deal with certain things as well. So it wasn't just the Soviets, it was also the loyal party bosses, the loyal party leaderships throughout the rest of the bloc, and of course including Yugoslavia, which was not officially part of the bloc, but was also closely related communist state, were also concerned about the changes that were taking place. Now, the most interesting response, I'll just mention it now, but we'll talk more about him and about it in a couple of weeks' time, was that of Nicolae Ceausescu, who had become General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party in 1965. He was a young buck. He was also a reforming figure at this time, and very famously, he was quite supportive of the transformations that were taking place in Czechoslovakia, because he also saw himself as a reforming figure. So we're gonna speak a lot about Ceausescu and the egregious nature of his rule in a couple of weeks' time. But I just want to flag that for the time being, but we will come back to him. Okay, now eventually what happened was very similar, unfortunately, to what happened in 1956. The reform movement seemed to take a momentum of its own, a momentum that the Dubček could not fully control, just as in 1956 in Hungary, Imre Nagy was not able to fully control the transformations that were taking place in Hungary. The decisive moment came when the Czechoslovak reform movement began to question the primacy of the Czechoslovak Communist Party as the guiding force, as the leading force within the Czechoslovak state and within Czechoslovak society. This was, of course, out of the question. That was a red line that no reform movement and no force at this stage within the Eastern Bloc could pass. It was one thing to question the 5-year plan. It was one thing to rehabilitate the purge victims of the Stalinist period. All of that was sort of within the remit, within the realm of the permissible. But when people started to question the hegemony of the Communist Party, that was a serious question. Because if you question the rule of the Communist Party, the next thing you do is probably you start to say, well, we need other parties, we need non-communist parties. And then you're simply a parliamentary democracy of the Western kind. You're no longer in the communist bloc, and it's the beginning of the end of the Eastern Bloc. So that was the red line. And people weren't vocally saying it's time to end the Communist Party rule, but there were serious questions about its role within state and society. And that was enough for the Soviets to initiate what became the invasion of Czechoslovakia. That's on slide number 9. In August 1968, Operation Danube. Now, there's a couple of differences to the Hungarian invasion of 1956. The first one is in 1956, essentially what you had was something like a small war. A low-intensity war. It was hopelessly outmatched, of course. You had on the one hand the Red Army and the Hungarian security forces, and the other hand you had these kind of street militia, anti-communist street militia. So there was no chance of sort of winning this thing. But nevertheless, the Hungarians did fight back. And as a result of this, the bloodshed was notable. About 1,000 people were killed, mainly on the side of the Hungarian security forces and the Red Army. This didn't happen in the Soviet Union. What you had was something more like passive resistance, like Gandhi-like resistance. The motto at the time was not a drop of water to the Russians. So don't if they ask for water, don't give them any. Ignore them. Don't talk to them. Just sort of blank them. So some people were killed in the initial phases of the invasion, but there was not an outright war as there had been in 1956. Now it's an ongoing syndrome. It's an ongoing complex in Czechoslovak mentality, because of course there was no fighting in the Munich after Munich either in 1938. The Wehrmacht simply came in and annexed the Czechoslovak territory, and there were many people who believed that the Czechoslovaks should have fought back, and there were again many people in '68 who sort of said that there was no hope. They just would have been hopelessly outmatched. Czechoslovak radio carried on broadcasting, that's just in this picture. It's just behind at the top of the picture. That's the National Museum in Prague, and just behind that, it's a district of Prague called Vinohrady. And then behind Vinohrady is a district called Vršovice, and that's where I live at the moment, just in case you're interested. But the national radio is just behind the museum, and that carried on broadcasting this sort of message of passive resistance against the occupation. Now, the other thing is that this was this time not just the Soviets, this was a Warsaw Pact invasion. So also Polish, East German, and Hungarian forces joined the fray and invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968. The only groups to stay, in fact, ultimately were the Soviets. The various other forces left relatively soon. The Soviets stayed right up until 1990. Okay. So that was the end of the reform movement. Dubček was arrested. He was not executed, which is, I suppose, an improvement. He probably thought he would be, but he eventually, I think, was sent out to Slovakia to become head of the Forestry Commission, which is a decent job, but was obviously something to get him way out the way. His career as a serious communist politician was over. The new person was also a Slovak, a man called Gustav Husak, who took over in, I think, 1969. Now, in the wake of this, the Brezhnev announced what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, and I've written that down on slide number 10. The key quote, the key text was the following thing: when forces that are hostile to socialism try to turn the development of some socialist countries towards capitalism, presumably what they felt had happened in Czechoslovakia, it becomes not only a problem of the country concerned, but a common problem of all socialist countries. What this essentially meant was that in the future, if something like this happened, there would be an invasion. The Soviets would invade the country in question. They would use military force, just as they had done in Czechoslovakia, just as they had done, for that matter, in Hungary, to make sure that the country did not break away from the communist bloc. It was a greatly dispiriting moment, not just in Czechoslovakia, but throughout the entire bloc. For many people, this was the end. For people like Vatsulik, for people like Kundera, who left the country. Shvoretsky left the country in 1969 as well, went to Canada, went to Toronto. Many of these people now felt that there was no hope of changing and reforming the system, that it was all over. That the notion that communism could sort of deliver a freer and a fairer society was over. This was obviously simply a matter of communist control, of Soviet control. It was just a military. It was just a system of power. It was not going to deliver a sort of a brighter and better future. It's a big difference if you compare the attitudes of people at the end of the 1940s, not just in Czechoslovakia, but also the people that Česlav Miloš wrote about. Very many people did hope. Even if they had not initially been communists, they did believe that the system could deliver something more prosperous, more freer, more fairer. Very few people believed that after the Soviet invasion. Now, a couple of things finally. In January 1969, a young man, a 20-year-old, possibly 21, a student at Prague University, a man called Jan Palach, it's a person who would be the same age as many of you, got on a train from the provincial town that he lived in very early in the morning, arrived in Prague, got off the metro, came out at the top of the main thoroughfare, the main avenue, Venceslas Square, Václavské náměstí, just in front of the museum that I showed you in the previous picture, doused himself with kerosene and set light to himself, and died about a week later from his wounds. He left a note, a suicide note, calling himself the Human Torch #1. He said there would be many more people like him, and he said his act was an act of defiance and an act of resistance against the communist occupation, against the Soviet occupation. What he wanted to do with this suicide was try to sort of stir people, stir his fellow citizens out of their passivity and into a full-blown revolution. So that happened in January 1969. There's a pretty decent film actually called Jan Palach, which is quite a touching, albeit slightly hagiographic and sort of idealized account Palak's history and Palak's story. So there were some people. Not everyone was passive. There were some people who took sort of action against this, and later on there was another person, another young man, who called himself Torch Number Two. And in fact, these self-immolations became not just in here, not just in Czechoslovakia, but also in Poland and in Bulgaria. It became sort of a means of protesting the communist regime. Okay, what did the communists want? Well, the passivity and the apathy that marked the period going forward in the 1970s and the 1980s was essentially helpful for the Communist Party, for the Soviets, but also for the new Czechoslovak Communist Party. They had been very spooked by what had happened in the 1960s, and they saw this as essentially a problem of excessive politicization. The people had become too active in politics, the people had become too agitated, and this is what was causing the problems that occurred, that culminated in the invasion of 1968. So the fact that people became very passive and very apathetic and very despairing of the prospects of communism as a political alternative and a political future, ironically, paradoxically enough, worked in the favor of the communist regime. The passivity and the apathy was in fact something that kept people off the streets. It meant that they weren't causing trouble any longer, and it meant that the communists could sort of restore the country, could rule over it in a much more straightforward manner. Now, the social contract, interestingly enough, that was formed between Czechoslovak people, Czechoslovak society, and the communist leadership was in very large part based on the kind of things that we'd been talking about in last week's sessions. We talked about consumption, we talked about leisure time, we talked about television, we talked about movies, we talked about this kind of thing. The communists now sort of created a basic level of sort of consumption that the Czechoslovak people would sort of get in return for not coming out onto the streets, for not being politicized. So television shows, holidays, a basic level of sort of, nothing like the West, not that level of opulence, but a basic level of sort of comfort and well-being. And it was hoped that this would placate the Czechoslovak people. Now, it's just a deal that was made not just in Czechoslovakia, but in other parts of the bloc in the 70s and the 1980s, the so-called period of late socialism, where the dreams and where the hopes of the communist period had been extinguished. The unwritten contract that the communist regimes had with the people was that now everyone would get a basic level of sort of consumption. They would get a weekend away in a small apartment. They might get a holiday at the Black Sea, and this is what they would get in exchange for keeping Sturm, for not rocking the boat, and for not causing trouble. Now, the most fascinating example, in my opinion, of this is a television show, a detective series. This is in slide number 12, which began showing in Czechoslovakia in the 1970s. This period was known as normalization, by the way, the post-Prague Spring period, the post-68 period. So the 1970s and the 1980s was known as the period of normalization, so of steadying relations, of restoring the economy, of restoring politics, of getting people calm again, of getting people back into their front rooms. Now, the communists did this by providing. One of the ways they did this was by providing, quality television shows, and the aim was that people would sort of stay inside and watch these television shows. That they would not come out onto the streets, because at 7 p.m. every Friday evening they would be watching one of these comedies, one of these movies, one of these television serials. That people loved. Now, put your hand up. I mean, I must admit, I'm a huge fan of various Netflix shows, not The Crown particularly, but other ones. I quite like The Queen's Gambit. And I know from my own experiences that watching television and watching that kind of thing deters you from doing other things, right? From my, in my case, doing my work, writing my book, or you know, preparing my lectures, or doing what I should be doing. The communists kind of knew this essential truth as well, and they decided, you know, that if they provided good TV shows, you know, it seems they decided that if they provided good TV shows, they could keep people indoors and out of harm's way and out of trouble. Um, the best example of normalized television in Czechoslovakia was the show in slide number 12. Shown between 1974 and 1979, a very good detective series called The 30 Cases of Maya Zeman. And Maya Zeman was a high-ranking officer in the communist secret police, the STB, so the security police in Czechoslovakia. I think there were 26 episodes. You can find them on YouTube. Alas, they are not. They don't have subtitles, which is a great shame. Because I would love to show you one of these episodes. Each episode takes place in a year since the coming of communism. So the first episode takes place in 1948, the second in 1949, the third in 1950, and so on, right up until its culmination in 1968. And in each of these episodes, Maya Zeman undergoes a sort of a transformation. He solves a case, so it's very much like whatever, you know, one of these detective shows like Poirot, or like Morse, or like one of these Scandi noir shows. It's like an anthology. Each one is a different case, a murder, a crime, theft, something like this. But we at the same time, it kind of tells the political history of the communist movement and the Communist Party. And Maya Zeman himself undergoes a psychological transformation. He experiences these disillusionments as well in the 1950s, just like many of his fellow citizens did. And eventually he sort of comes through, so that by the time we get to the episodes that are set in the 1960s, Maya Zeman realizes that communism is the future, that communism needs to be rescued, and this is what needs to be done, and he sort of finds a new impetus to do so. So it's really fascinating, and you can tell that I'm a fan of this show, despite its problematic nature. It's not only that this is a very entertaining detective show modeled on the American shows like Columbo and Starsky and Hutch and this kind of thing. So it's not only that it's good entertainment, and for the communists, they realize that this entertaining show will keep people off the streets and will keep people in their front rooms. But at the same time, the actual plots and the actual content of the show has this kind of didactic, quality, that it's teaching the people, it's teaching its viewers how, how we've all been through these troubles together, how we've experienced the 50s, the economic downturn of the 1960s, culminating in the Prague Spring, but ultimately, just like the great hero Maya Zeman, we need to sort of stick with communism. This is our best hope. This is our best future. It's not been translated, unfortunately. There's not a version with subtitles, but there is a very good book by my friend Paulina Bren, The Greengrocer and His TV, The Culture of Communism After the 1968 Prague Spring, which tells the story of this television show, how it was produced, the actors. Of course, the main actor was quite famous. He died a few years ago, and it talks a little bit about this. It's a classic example of sort of late socialist consumption, consumerist culture, pop culture, and it's kind of a classic. And anyway, we'll leave it there.